Welcome to a realm where personal growth meets expansive spirituality and where we're not just scratching the surface, we're diving deep, widening our perspectives and having a darn good time doing it. This is the Enliven Podcast and I am your host, Jen Hamilton. You'll enjoy an infusion of motivation, empowerment, and inspiration that will resonate in every aspect of your life. Expect captivating stories, heartfelt musings, and my own personal experiences. But that's not all. I'm bringing awe-inspiring individuals to the table, so get ready to meet some remarkable souls whose wisdom and stories will leave you spellbound. No topic is off limits here. Brace yourself for raw authenticity, unfiltered vulnerability, and yes, the occasional splash of explicit language. We're delving into the realms of the esoteric, mystical, and the woo-woo, unafraid to explore the extraordinary. So if you are ready to venture beyond the surface, to explore the depths of your soul, and to awaken the magic of life, if your heart says yes, then hit that play button and let the Enliven Podcast guide you on this remarkable expedition. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Enliven Podcast. I am your host, Jen, and my very special guest today is Mark Brouwer. Mark is a spiritual teacher, writer, and speaker. He serves as the pastor of Bethel Church in Princeton, Minnesota. He's also the director of Renew Resources, which provides teachings, retreats, and support for leaders who struggle with anxiety, depression, or addiction. For 5 years, Mark worked with Dr. Mark Laaser as the Director of Training for Faithful and True Ministries, which focuses on addiction, recovery, and marriage restoration. Over time, the work that Mark did with Dr. Laaser shifted to focus more on providing coaching and guidance to spiritual leaders and eventually back into pastoral ministry. The conversation that I got to have with Mark was so eye-opening and enlightening, and we talk a lot about moving from religion and more into an open, broader perspective into spirituality. There is so much wisdom and gold nuggets in this conversation, and I know that you're going to love it and get so much out of it. So without further ado, let's dive in. Hello and welcome, Mark. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
Mark, you're a spiritual teacher. Tell us all about, I guess, like how you got into this and the magic that you do and that you bring to the world.
Well, it actually started as a musician. I took a year off from college. In fact, I hoped to become a full-time musician, and so I took a year off of college, toured in a band, and while I was touring, I think two things happened. I was sort of disillusioned about the life of a traveling musician, and in the context, it was a religious rock group, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like Christian rock. And then we would give some talks about our faith in the process of giving these concerts. We played in a lot of schools, and then churches and schools basically. And anyway, I found that I found more meaning in what I was doing with the talking with people about issues of faith. And so then I just started to I went back to school, exploring, being a minister, and each step along the way that just seemed to be confirmed, and it was kind of the right thing to do, or seemed like the right thing to do. So that's what I did. I went then like through college, and then seminary training. I have it's called a Master's of Divinity, is what in my thing they call it, some master's thing, but it's Christian theology. And then I've been a pastor. So I've been a pastor now 32 years.
Wow.
So yeah, that's the path I've been on.
Yeah. And so with being a pastor, so tell us a little bit about the religious side of things. Has this always been something? Did you grow up with a religious background or in a religious family?
Yes, I did. I grew up in a Christian environment, and really, I would say, this is all pre-internet, and it was easier to be in bubbles at that point, and so And I'll give one example of this. So I received, my training and went to college at a liberal arts college, and so there was a fair bit of um, different different worldviews and stuff. I went to seminary in Michigan. It's called Calvin Seminary, and I had a world religions course. And in that world religions course, we had weeks study of each of the various world religions. And what's interesting is that as life went on, life unfolded for me. What I went through a time. We can get into this more if you'd like, but I went through a time where I began to be very disillusioned about my faith and had lots of questions about God and connecting to God. And I suppose with some of the language we use today, you might think of it as I was struggling with my spiritual life in the midst of the religion that I was a part of, right? And that led me to through a whole long search. And there's a term that people use here in the U.S. I don't know if it's big in Australia, but people talk about deconstructing
Mm.
in religion or in faith. So deconstructing, which is, I know, the postmodern idea, but you deconstruct not just concepts, but you deconstruct your concepts about your faith and your religious background and what I grew up hearing and believing that I no longer believe, that don't make sense to me now. And that was the case for me it was the case for me that when I started to sort of like open that door, a lot of questions came up for me. And then uh, again, it's a long story. I don't know how much we want to get into that story, but the thing happened for me that as I explored it all, kind of put it all, maybe you could just say just blew the whole thing up. Um, and at a certain point, um, sort of began engaging again in this in a faith in my faith, in a relationship with God, in a connection to divine, however you might word it. So what emerged for me was different, I believe different, or I mean, deeper and more authentic. That's how I experienced it. And, really now that experience for me was probably about 15 to 20 years ago. And I left the church ministry role for a while. And I did come back to it. And I work with a lot of Christian people. And part of the work that I do with people is helping them. There's this idea in it's one of the Apostle Paul's letters where he talks about like he says, when I was a child, I thought like a child, I spoke like a child, I reasoned like a child, but then when I became a man, I put those childish ways behind me. And so what I'm wanting to do or trying to do is help people put childish religious ideas, childish perspectives about spirituality that just aren't working, and then help people kind of re-engage with what is.
Wow, that's incredible. And yes, we can dive deep into all parts. I'm so curious, Mark, was there any, I guess, backlash or repercussions when you left ministry and you started to explore other versions of spirituality? Was that ever frowned upon in the church or by any leaders?
Well, sure. I only really began that deep dive after I stepped away from ministry. Okay. So I went through this period of burnout, which I think that's what we were ultimately going to talk about. So we can go back to that. But the burnout experience for me then jumped into or sort of transitioned into an experience of kind of like rethinking my spirituality, rethinking my faith. And so when I began like reading books and watching podcast or listening to podcasts, watching different people on YouTube, just sort of going down this rabbit hole, um, I was I felt free to do that because I wasn't pastoring a church. I think it's an old Mark Twain or some American author said it's and this had to do with politics, but it's very true about the spiritual realm. Said it's hard to get a man to question something when his salary depends on him not questioning it. And so for ministers, I mean, it's not even so much a salary thing, but it's like everything around you is sort of built around you believing this, advocating this, helping other people believe this, teaching that. And so it can be really challenging for pastors because, or any religious teacher, I think, because you have the party line that everyone is kind of signed up for, and you're helping them grow in it. And if you have experiences that cause you to question it, or that where you're like, I'm not sure that this is really working for me, there's a lot of pressure, as your question indicates, a lot of pressure to not talk about that. For me, the way it played out, Jen, is that I'd look at a book, let's say, and if it was a book that I knew was going to challenge beliefs that I had, cause me to question things, I would just not read it. And so I literally remember it's a dramatic time. There was a night I was in a bookstore. I had left my ministry role, and I had this book, and it was a book that there were parts of the book that were like specifically critical of Christian faith. And there was a chapter in there about the possibilities of life on other planets and just a variety of things, like from a variety of perspectives, challenging some of the status quo. And it was kind of intriguing to me. And I remember thinking, looking at this book, saying, I probably shouldn't read this. And then I'm like, wait a minute, why? Because I'm not a pastor right now. And if reading this is going to cause me to question or rethink something that I've believed, then that probably needs to be questioned, right? If my beliefs or my perspective about spirituality does not stand up to scrutiny, it's probably not worth holding that. So I got the book, and I started a whole sequence then of which led me pretty quickly into a lot of atheist authors, like the new atheists, Sam Harris. I can't think of the other names now, but and then that led me to people from a Christian background who approach their Christianity differently, Buddhist authors, Taoist authors, and then later some, not so much Islam, but especially Sufi authors, and all of that sort of churning for me for really probably over a couple of years. It led me then, ultimately to re-embrace, or I don't know what the right word is, but kind of the place I am now is I still believe and consider myself to be a follower of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, and I am comfortable within the Christian faith, and yeah, I as comfortable as a person can be who is going to be honest about everything that they're experiencing and seeing around them.
Yeah. Do you feel like as a pastor, relating with other pastors, do you feel like there's a sense of cognitive dissonance when you're in that space? Because like you were sort of saying, it was almost like you were conditioned to just be in, let's call it a box, in that box of one specific faith, one specific teaching, because what you were saying was it wasn't until you stepped outside of ministry that it's like you felt safe to be able to explore beyond those teachings. Tell me about that. Did you feel as though once you were out of it, then you could look back and go, oh, whoa, hang on a second?
Yeah, that is right. And I yeah, there are well-known examples of pastors who left their Christian faith, wrote about it, and just sort of they experienced the dissonance to such a degree that they had to leave. And for me, it was mostly a matter of uncertainty and questions, and then found some resolution in a different way of doing it, that allowed me to sort of come back in. I would say this. So I run coaching programs for men, and that are not, kind of all varieties of careers. And then I also have coaching specifically for spiritual leaders.
Mm.
And so I've been doing this for, well, since 2007 about. So it's over 1,000 people that I've worked with now, and most of them Christian. And what I would say is that most of the people, no, I'm just gonna, off the top of my head, say about half of the Christian men that I work with, they feel comfortable in their Christian faith, don't have a lot of questions or struggles about it, and the challenges that they're facing in life have to do with other things. But then about half of them, these are men who are attending church, or maybe they have attended church and are not any longer because they're not sure. Sort of like what they're hearing or what they've heard from the pulpit or when they read the Bible. It's like it doesn't match with how they experience life, and they're kind of like, how do I deal with that dissonance? So again, with the general audience, maybe it's half and half. With the pastors that I work with, I maybe it's 80-20, 70-30, that the vast majority uh, are more or less comfortable and confident about the faith that they are teaching. But then there are some that do have questions. And yeah, I wrote an article about this, and I call it Arrested Spiritual Development.
Mm.
And it has to do with this very thing we're talking about, that as a Christian teacher, and again, I'm going to assume that Islamic teacher, an imam, someone in a Buddhist faith, if you have a party line that you are kind of expected to adhere to, and pretty much all your reading and input is built within these walls, you can face it, where you can have a problem because then there are questions that come or whatever that you struggle to deal with. And rather than dealing with them, you just sort of like, it's kind of like, I just don't want to go there. I'm going to push it down. Let's not talk about that, and let's just move on, which I believe leads us to arrested spiritual development. That's like a childlike faith that develops over time when you do that, I believe.
Mm, yes, yes, that's so true, isn't it? I'm curious, Mark, your relationship with God, did that shift as you went through your evolution?
Yes, absolutely. And probably what you could say that's sort of the heart of the issue. And to the conservative Christian background that I came out of, uses that language a lot, a relationship with God. And there's a lot of assumptions in that concept, right? And it can also, we have in our heads, what do we mean when we talk about God? We have these assumptions about what that means. And for me, this actually was the heart of the disillusionment, was that I was trained, and everything that I'd heard and read and the message that was reinforced was that God was a certain way and expected me to live a certain way and to pray. And if I did these things and I prayed, then God would do these other things, right? So it's sort of like we have this invisible or this unspoken agreement, this sort of contract. And then what was happening is that God was not, quote unquote, showing up in my life in the way that God was supposed to, right? And so that then that was sort of like the first domino falling, and everything. So like raises all these questions. And so this quote unquote relationship with God thing became for me very, very confusing, and actually almost language that I was very uncomfortable with, because the idea of a relationship with God seemed to have a certain assumptions about about what that means, almost like I would have a relationship with another friend of mine. But the problem is that God is the infinite, beyond our comprehension, beyond our understanding. Um, and so in this regard, I think I've gotten a little bit more respect for people from the Jewish tradition, that don't even say the name of God. And it's this recognition, and this is certainly there too in Christian teaching. There's a tradition in Christian teaching which really focuses on that the way we have to think about God is like there's so much we don't know about God. We tend to focus on the things that we do know about God, but God is so far beyond that. And so again, that has helped me to make sense of life and to make sense of an ongoing. I often probably am more comfortable using the language of feeling the connection with God rather than a relationship with God. And within Christian teaching there is the concept of the recognition we are created in the image of God. In Quaker teaching, they would say there is that of God in us. There's God's presence, or there's something about God in us. And in the New Testament, we talk about that as the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of God in us. And it's that sense of a connection with God mediated through the Spirit of God in me that makes more sense, or is more helpful for me to think about having a quote unquote relationship with, as opposed to some
Connection
big
with.
guy up in the sky who for some reason seems an awful lot like my dad, for better or worse, right?
Yes, yes. I grew up Catholic, so Catholic school, Catholic church. I was an altar server.
Okay.
So my mum came from the Catholic side. My dad was Baptist and not practicing at all. So we went to church every Sunday. We had church services through school, and I got to the point, in my early teen years where I was like, hang on, this doesn't make sense to me. And the fear of God that existed within me in those prime years of, when we're sponges, all of that information coming in and we're setting our belief systems, I truly felt there was, a bit of an indoctrination happening in those early years. And, that it's just the way it was. Do you know what I mean? I don't hold it against my parents for sending me to a church or a school. It was just the done thing then. And I got to the point where I started questioning things, and I was like, hang on a second, why am I feeling as though I'm being watched, or that I have to prove myself, or I have to be a certain way in order to go to heaven? Or, so all of these, I guess lies. And I got to the point where I was like, is this actually serving me? And I remember like having to have the conversation with my mum to say, I don't want to go to church anymore. And I still remember, Mark, the first Christmas that I didn't go to church.
Mm,
And I felt so empowered, so rebellious, and so scared
yep.
because my whole family went, and I was like, oh my God, what have I done? Like I've let God down. I've let my mum down. And then, the world didn't end. I didn't implode, I was actually okay. And then, further down the track, especially in my early 20s, I discovered more what spirituality was. And I was able to, not in the depths that you have, but, just receive teachings from other places that, weren't necessarily aligned with, Catholicism or Christianity, but it was the opportunity to just explore a broader perspective. And then also, stepping more into, I guess, esoteric and metaphysical spirituality, which is, the line that I've gone down. And then having to rewrite my relationship or my connection with God, because for many, many, many years, I couldn't even use the word God because I still had that deep ingrained, man in the sky. In fact, my image of what God was actually our priest from when I lived in Melbourne when I was a little girl. We moved up to Queensland when I was 5. So with that, like from such a young age going to church, I just assumed that was God because he was like this big old man on the stage that I guess just looked like a God. So if I needed a physical image in my mind, that's what I came up with. And
Yeah.
so unraveling all of that, was such a big, beautiful journey. And it's only been in the last probably 18 months I have comfortably used the word God again. I would use
Oh,
universe. I started using source. I couldn't do the God thing. And then when it landed and I realized then I actually get to decide what that connection, that relationship is. No one has to tell me what that is. I can decide for myself what that is. And for me, that was such a beautiful journey
mm,
to unravel all of those pieces, as you were saying before, like that deconditioning process, taking all of those pieces and going, hang on, what do I want it to be? And then it was actually so doing that within myself and then verbalizing it, because there was still, like, if I was using the word God, it's like, oh, she's religious, just mind what you say kind of thing. So
right.
just noticing within myself that journey, and it has been such a beautiful journey as well, and that I've been able to, instead of completely dismiss religion, it's like, well, hang on a second. If I choose to have a faith in whatever I choose to have a faith in, by virtue of that, someone else gets to have that experience for themselves as well, you know?
Yes. Oh, that makes a lot of sense. There's an author that I highly recommend people check out, and there's a lot of stuff on YouTube where she's interviewed, and her name is Lisa Miller. Um, Comes from a Jewish faith background, but is trying to do research about the spiritual core of human beings that that people can accept just from a scientific perspective, whatever, like you can't even deny it. She is doing peer-reviewed research on the role of the spiritual connection people have, right?
Wow.
And so that's a helpful way, I think, for everyone, for us to be able to think about it and be able to talk about it with people who don't share our particular, background, our particular beliefs. I myself grew up where everyone is comfortable talking about God. And again, we think we know what we're talking about when we talk about God. And it kind of, the other perspective for me was I found it helpful to use other terms because it helps me remind myself that it's not, um, God may not be exactly what I think, or that it's not as this domesticated thing that I think I've sort of got my arms around. So I've never been uncomfortable with it, but I found that it's helpful to think about it differently.
And I think it's also, about having that open mind as well, to be able to be so open that it can become fluid in your thoughts as well, that you are open to realizing that the version of God that exists for you can actually be expanded on as well. Because it's hard for our human minds to comprehend infinity. And I was talking to it's actually someone interviewing me on a podcast yesterday, and we had this conversation. I had something drop in for me the other day, and it was around the concept of time. And so the concept of time is, it's a human construct on this plane, on the 3D level, time and space. And beyond the human existence, time doesn't exist. And so I know that there's a lot of people that refer to God as the creator, and the reference point of creation would actually give a start point, which actually then is on the basis of time. And so I was trying to wrap my head around, well, if there's no concept of time, how do we have a starting point? Because I was listening to something a few days ago about the concept of the Big Bang, what was before the Big Bang? And I think that's the question on everyone's mind, when you go through some sort of existential crisis. And so for me, it was thinking to myself, okay, but what is infinite existence if we don't have a creator, if it was never created because there was no starting point? What does that mean? And it's not something that my human brain can find an answer to, but it definitely invoked some curiosity within me.
Yeah.
And so, these are the things that I like to explore as well, because what I found in certain religions, in Christianity, is that it gave you a starting point, and it even gave a starting point that wasn't even in alignment with the scientific version of human evolution. It's like, oh no, we don't talk about evolution. We talk about Adam and Eve, and we talk about this
Right.
starting point. And so for me, it was kind of like, oh, can I get on board with this? And then I started exploring, well, what else can I not get on board with? And am I giving myself that big old permission slip to explore beyond that? And it sounds like what you needed was that permission slip within yourself. I'm curious to know as well, Mark, for you, when that permission slip came through to say to yourself, I'm going to move on from this for now. I'm going to explore other things. What was that like for you?
Well, I would say that, to be honest, it was at first it was sad. At first it was like feeling a loss. And I didn't know where it was going to end up. And once again, for me, it felt like I had to let it all go, and I believe at this point, with all due respect to people who come from the atheist perspective, the new atheist, it feels to me like it's this false choice. I mean, I have more respect for someone who would call themselves agnostic, but because it's sort of like um, it seemed like this choice between accepting everything that I'd grown up with, or it's all BS and nothing is meaningful. And so it's sort of like the proverbial throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You throw everything out, which is what I did. Maybe this is all, BS. Maybe none of this is true. Maybe this is, we've all been lying to each other. Maybe there's not even a God out there. And at that point, then I continued searching. Maybe at that point I would have gotten into drinking heavily or something. but part of it, I kept the search, and I just came to this sense of there is something out there, and there is a variety of ways that people have talked about it. And I have this thought, going back to what you were saying about, okay, so some people grew up with, we have certain answers to these big questions that we've been told, because like the Bible says this about Adam and Eve and how creation happened in 7 24-hour days, and so then we take that text and we create this whole narrative about it, the structure about it, and then if we find information that contradicts that, it's sort of like, okay, does the whole house of cards fall then? And so someone talked about, I believe the Bible is accurate or trustworthy or doesn't lead us into error in all that it teaches. Or someone even would say, in all that it intends to teach. And the problem is we try to make it teach all kinds of things. And that's, again, from as I'm navigating my own religious tradition, that's what I try to be really careful about, what is it that is being taught here that is true for all time and all circumstances, and what is time bound, culture bound, specific context oriented. And anyway, that has helped me to sort of like have fewer like big picture universal truths that I may discover aren't so true. You know what I mean?
I don't know if you know the work of Neville Goddard.
Yes.
Yes, and I started listening on Audible. I'm a bit of an Audible junkie. I love audiobooks. And so I was listening to his set of 10 books, and they're quite small, and I hadn't got right through them because it's a lot to digest. It's been around for quite some time, and it's very I'd say it's quite deep. But one of the things that he says is the Bible is an amazing psychological thriller. And I find it fascinating because then the way he sort of breaks down, essentially perhaps the coding that is the Bible of God, of Jesus, of disciples, of the certain language that the Bible is, bringing God, the concept of God back to the I am presence. For me, that just dropped in and made so much sense. And so, I'm grateful for my experience growing up in a Catholic environment because it exposed me to these teachings. So I had a reference point. And I'm also grateful for the opportunity to sidestep that and say, well, okay, what would it look like if I stepped, outside of the ring and went into a different arena? And I feel that whenever we go through, our personal evolution, our stages of growth, everything does have to burn to the ground. We do have to go through that sadness. It is a grieving period because we hold on to things so tightly, which, we have proof for. If we're going to church every week, if we're surrounded by, at school and these teachings, if we have the Bible as a reference point, that's our level of proof. We're creatures of proof. It's how we've survived, so long on this planet. And then when we have that proof taken away, or we realize, the depths of the disillusionment in that, it's going to catapult us into a grief process. And which I think is a beautiful space to be, because then it's what I call the void. It's going into that space of the nothingness. And we're so often taught that that space is a scary place to be, or because it's the unknown, we don't know how to process it if we haven't allowed ourselves to go there before. But what I truly feel within that is it then gives us space to then come out of it going, well, hang on, what am I choosing from here? What am I taking with me? How can I see things from a different perspective if my original perspective no longer exists?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, there's so much there. I agree and want to emphasize, just underscore what you're saying. That's so true. The I'll say this in response to what you just said, Jen, that part of the process that I encourage people to undergo when I work with them, this is what I do, and you can do this on your own as well. And this was hugely significant in my own spiritual journey. And that was like, you get to those points where it's sort of like, something's not working here. And so take a sheet of paper and you make 3 sections. And so the first is this list. These are the things that I was taught to believe. These are the things that I have believed. And I am not sure about them. I am not sure. I wonder, And then underneath that, these are the things that I was taught to believe that I know are not true. Okay. And then beneath that is these are the things that I believe are true. And it may be from the things that I was taught that I grew up, and maybe it's other things that I've experienced. And so again, it's probably the work of an hour. It's not huge length of time. It's just usually been about a page, but it's sort of been a culmination of a lot of processing, and it's been super helpful to clarify for me. Because what I found helpful is, and again, it's like, as opposed to just throwing everything out and just going to the movies or going to get drunk or whatever, just go on with life, just to say, okay, this isn't working. Let me get honest about what life is showing to me, what life is revealing. And so that honesty, that integrity means that I have to get honest about the things that I'm not sure about. And I have to get honest about those things that I just don't believe anymore. And then I can also think about things that I embrace. And boy, just doing that, I think, has revolutionized my faith and has revolutionized the faith of some other people. Yeah. So
Yeah.
it sounds like you've done that. You've been doing that work, maybe not in that particular way, but that's kind of the spiritual work that we all do.
Yeah, I actually have a resource that I use with my clients that I came up with, and it's called a belief deconstruction. So there's about probably 30 questions, to break down the belief system, to find out where it came from, whose it was,
Yeah.
how has it served us, how hasn't it served us, what might happen if I continue with this belief, what might happen if I change this belief. So really just sort of breaking it apart and then going, well, what do I choose to believe instead? And where can I find proof in order to sustain this belief as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because like I said, we're creatures of proof. We need, like, our brains need to have proof of something in order to continue to believe it. Mark, I want to circle round to, the support that you do. You said that you work with spiritual leaders, you're in the coaching space, you work with people with burnout. Let's talk about that. Tell us about the work that you do with that.
So I, for a number of years, when I left church work, I worked in the sphere of recovery from addiction. And so I worked as a director of training for an organization that worked with people with addiction and recovery. And so after I did that for a while, I felt like I didn't want that to be my life's work, and I was feeling more drawn back into church ministry. And so what happened for me is that as things evolved, is that as I was doing this work with recovery, I kind of became the go-to guy for spiritual leaders who are in recovery. And so then I had these groups of pastors or missionaries or professors who were dealing with addiction and whatever. And so then I started doing more coaching with those folks about recovery. And then, of course, what would happen is you are talking about a lot of things other than specific addiction. You're talking about the stress with their marriage, the things with what's happening in their church. This person is on their board that they're having a hard time with. So a lot of focus on just sort of general leadership stuff. Anyway, go back into church work while I'm doing that stuff part-time. And then when the pandemic hit, I saw the explosion of addiction happening during the challenging times, and just felt like I wanted to do some more with that. So I started a program called Renewed Man, which is for men, and the idea is it's not like for a full-blown addict, but just for someone who needs help dealing with compulsive behaviors in general, food, sex, drinking, whatever. So that's a program that I have for men in general. And then there's a sub part of that, which is now growing, called Renewed Leaders. And that is for leaders to do their work in a way that's healthy. So it's not necessarily that they're focused, they're not necessarily in recovery from addiction, but they just know they need to be emotionally and spiritually healthy in order to be able to help others and not burn out.
Wow, that's incredible, the work that you do. What are you finding is, the catalyst for people coming through? When we talk about addiction, from my perspective, as a coach, as a hypnotherapist, we see addiction as, there's an underlying reason to that. It's generally a feeling that doesn't want to be felt, or something that doesn't want to be addressed. What are you seeing, I guess, is sort of the biggest thing that, that men are coming through with at the moment?
Yeah. Well, I'll say one thing to start out with, as sort of the preface statement, is that I started working with addiction with this idea that there was a cause. And what I came to realize is it's a multifaceted issue. And so it depends on the person. I feel like there's types maybe. And so one of the issues, the guy that I work with, his primary thing, he said it was always having to do with unprocessed early life trauma. And my view is almost always that's the case, but not always. So there's oftentimes that's a significant part of it. There's something that growing up, we learned, or we didn't get what we needed, whatever. So unprocessed trauma. And so the healing journey for a lot of people has to do with uncovering some of the stuff that has been happening for a long time with them. I also think it might be kind of a subcategory of that, but I do treat it differently, and that is the inability to deal with stress.
Mm.
Just the strategies, the life skills required to deal with setbacks, to deal with pressure. Um, so that's a huge one. And then another sphere would be, and again, you can call this, is this a subcategory of the thing of the first thing or not? But I treat it separately, is isolation. And this is a huge thing for men. Is to that we're not connecting in any meaningful way with what's really going on in our heart, in our soul. So so those three things, I would say, with the addiction stuff that I work with, those are the three kind of core things that seem to emerge as sort of like key issues. Um, the way that I word it is to say that it's you anyone can get recovery for a few months. You just have to work really hard and keep your foot on the accelerator and just focus on your recovery. But very few people do it long term. And the reason that that's the case is you have to become a different person. There has to be a deeper transformation. And so what we talk about is to move to a place of emotional, relational, and spiritual health. And when we're in that place, then we're able to deal with life's ups and downs without having to go back to whatever it is. Another way of saying that, more crass way of saying that, is it's hard to stay sober if your life sucks.
I
You
like
know,
that.
if your life
Yeah.
isn't working in one of these spheres, you can stay sober for a while, but not for long, because eventually your willpower is going to wear down and you're just going to go to it. So that's what I focus on. And so it turns out that sort of same mindset about building emotional, relational, and spiritual well-being, that's essential for someone who wants to be a leader, a high capacity leader without burning out. It's kind of a lot of the same kinds of things. Dealing with early life trauma stuff, getting healthy relationships, figuring out how to manage your stress level. Those three things are like essential for the spiritual leader as well as they are essential for the recovering addict.
It's so true, isn't it? And especially, the leaders need support. I see myself as a leader, I see you as a leader. We need to be doing the work on ourselves as well, because one of the biggest things that we face is burnout, because we're in support to other people, we're holding space for other people, we're in a space of teaching, we're in a space of coaching. And if we're not supporting ourselves and our mental, emotional, and spiritual health, then we're going to hit the button that just says, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. I'm burnt out. Tell us about some of the ways in which you see people coming to you that are experiencing burnout, Mark.
Yeah. So we've been talking a fair bit about what I would call authentic spirituality, right? Having an authentic spiritual connection, and maybe you're religious, but it's not working in some way. So that's one of the things that, particularly if people are in trying to help other people spiritually, if their own spiritual connection is not strong, um, that's gonna they're gonna burn out, right? So that would be one thing that happens. Probably what I find more with the clients that I work with the, let's say, the pastors that are in these groups with me, missionaries that are in groups, um, it's probably that they're isolated, um, and that they they struggle dealing with anxiety and stress. Um, so there was a time when I was part of this church, and it was a really growing church, and it was like really great. But this is right before I was burnt out. I actually, that's what the church I left, because I just hit a wall. And I remember, I think it was only later when I looked back, and I was getting, counseling and stuff. And what I realized, and this is going to seem strange to say, it might seem narcissistic to say, but this is true. I realized I did not have friends. I had a group of fans, and then I
Mm.
had a group of critics.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that the people in my church were my friends, and the people on my staff were my friends. And the people on staff, I thought, Jen, that I was funnier than I really am, because I would tell jokes and they would laugh really loud. Well, they just did that because I was the boss, right? They wanted to be on my good side, right? So I had all these relationships where they weren't authentic relationships. And so I realized I was ultimately pretty lonely. Or I didn't feel lonely, but what I realized, I didn't have genuine connections. So, and I think
Mm-hmm.
that's the case for a lot of spiritual leaders. And then, yeah, stress. I mean, yeah, you have a lot of things that you want to happen that aren't happening, or things that are problems that you're having to deal with. And um, yeah, many. I'll just say, for myself, I know I did not have the internal resources to deal with that stress the way that I needed to.
Mm.
And I find that's true of a lot of other guys too.
Yeah. Mark, for anyone listening to this that is resonating, so whether it's, moving from that religious space into that spiritual space, being a leader and facing burnout, what's some advice or, some wisdom that you would like to impart on listeners?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing that I would say to everybody would be, who can you talk to about this?
Mm.
So part of it is getting out of our own heads, um, and talking to someone, whether that be a therapist, a spiritual leader, a coach, ideally a friend, maybe a couple of friends. And the challenge with our friends is it has to be people that are willing to be honest with us, and have some like self-awareness themselves, so they're not just gonna reflect unhealthy stuff back to us. But get out of your own head, talk about this with some people. um I would say the exercises that we're talking about, the thing that you do, the more simplified version that I do, just like, what is not working in your spiritual life, and then how can you re-embrace your spiritual connection in a way that's real.
Mm.
um and yeah, if some of us frankly will need, whether it's therapy or a deep dive with coaches. The bottom line, this world is very challenging and stressful, and I think all of us are are being called on to step up our game in dealing with the levels of anxiety and stress and pressure that everyone feels. So, um, you know, yeah, no one's alone, but in order to be happy, we all have to step up our game.
That's so true. Thank you for that. What is something that you would say to someone listening out there that wants to deepen their connection with God, but they feel as though, maybe something in our conversation has sparked a thought for them that, perhaps they are bound by a religion that says God is a certain way, but they want to explore a deeper connection. What would you say to someone that's sort of on that tipping point going, oh, I want to discover what a deeper version of God is, but I don't know how to, I don't know what to do.
Yeah. Um, make space for it. Ideally in the morning, or maybe you're better at night, but just have some time where you are able to be quiet. Maybe write down if something's stressing you out, whatever, get that out. Um, and there's this great prayer. It's called the Seeker's Prayer, and it goes like this: God, if there is a God, save my soul if I have a soul. And the idea, what I would alternate it by saying, God, if there is a God, if you're out there, um, reveal yourself to me, show yourself to me, help me to not necessarily give me a sign, but just help me to see a path forward. So sort of like open up that space, um, and then pay attention. I mean, maybe it's just me. This is my background. Is I do like learning. If you're a reader kind of person, I would encourage you to read a couple of articles or a couple of books by various authors that that you've heard of that are helpful people, and then do that exercise about what are they saying that makes sense to me, what is it that doesn't make sense, what do I agree with, what do I don't agree with. So like keep connecting with what resonates, and then let the rest of it go.
I love that. We will obviously link to all of that in the show notes, and obviously, your website and how people can connect with you. Mark, I have one final question for you before we wrap up. And to you, what is the meaning of life?
Well, I keep going back to purpose with that. This may not be the perfect, the right answer to your question, getting to where you are, but for me, the meaning is the unfolding of my connection to God, and how I can serve the people around me. So again, in this regard, meaning and purpose are kind of coming together, but it's those two things that I think about that's sort of wrapped up into everything, is my connection with God and the way that I can serve.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for coming on the Enlighten podcast. It's been absolutely incredible to have this conversation with you.
Thank you, Jan. Thanks for inviting me. It's good to visit with you.
Thanks. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode. I hope you love the Enlighten podcast, and the biggest compliment you can give me is subscribing to this podcast, sharing it, and leaving a rating and review. Feel free to follow me on Instagram. My handle is @JenHamiltonOfficial, and the podcast handle is enlightened_podcast. You can also find the video version on YouTube on my channel. Just search Enlightened, and don't forget to hit subscribe. Have a beautiful day and enjoy living the enlightened journey of life.